Today I want to talk about the Declaration of Independence. This is a famous painting depicting it. This is the actual declaration. When we first look at this, obviously we see they wrote really small. They didn't really do paragraph form, and it doesn't seem incredibly long, and it really isn't for such an important document. So here's the text. You can see July 4th, 1776. These are the signers, John Hancock. You can see wrote his name really big. He was the president of this convention or the meeting. A little bit of background. After the Battle of Lexington, which is when the war started, the colonists at this point really had two choices. They could declare their independence, which would mean the war is going to continue against the British, or they could stay with Britain, continue to protest to the king what they thought was unfair, try to work some things out, and that might end or avoid war. So this one went on for a year, and they really didn't do one or the other. The first year of the war was mainly in Boston, a little bit in New York, but it wasn't all over the colonies at this point in time. Then, about a year after the war started, the colonies get together for their second meeting in Philadelphia. Each colony sent at least one representative, and at the second meeting, that's when they finally agree that they're going to declare their independence. So Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was our setting, July 4th, 1776. Obviously, our Independence Day. It took longer than one day. You'll see that in just a second. Thomas Jefferson was the main author. Adams and Franklin, two other guys, helped him. If I remember correctly, originally another man was supposed to write it, but he went to Jefferson and said, "Hey, I want you to do this because you're the better writer." Jefferson sits down, starts on July 11th, spends 2.5 weeks on it, comes back, presents the letter. They read through it, kind of like we do in English class when you're doing a big paper. Your first copy is a rough draft. They went through, they edited it, and then they approved it on July 4th. As soon as they approve it, they send it off to get printed because they need to send copies to each colony, letting them know what happened. Those got sent out, and it actually didn't get signed till August 2nd. But we recognize July 4th because that's when they all agreed to it. In the Declaration, there's four main sections to it. Section 1 is the shortest. It's the preamble. It's just an introduction. You do this in English class. You'll do this in social studies class, where you introduce to the reader what you are planning on talking about. Then he goes into the rights of the people, explaining as people what rights that they have. Section 3 is actually the longest. It's called the list of grievances, and there's close to 40 of them. Grievances are complaints. And this is when Jefferson really starts going off on Britain, and in particular King George. He calls out King George several times in the grievances, and they're complaining about all the things: taxes, killing of innocent people, things like that. And then the last section, he ends the letter letting King George and Britain know that they're breaking apart and declaring their independence. It's at this point in time, they don't say anything about we are forming a new country. That comes a little bit later, and it doesn't become official until they write a new constitution. So this is just the breakup. This is probably the most famous line from the Declaration. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So that's a little bit tricky. So what I've done here is I've kind of broken it down. Some of those underlined words here are the easier answers, if you will. Self-evident means obvious or clear. All men are created equal. So he wrote that. Should we take this literally? And the answer is no. When Jefferson and the others wrote and approved this, they were thinking about all white men. They weren't thinking about women. They weren't thinking about people of color. There was some debate on whether they should even mention slavery in the Declaration of Independence, and they decided not to. There's not one mention of slaves in it. So I get they said all men are created equal, but in their minds, they were thinking all white men. Endowed by our Creator. That's the line that probably throws the people off the most. The translation here is given, he's talking about rights, and these rights are given to us by God. Unalienable means they can't be taken away. And the three rights he mentions are life, liberty, and happiness. So these are like your forever rights. And liberty, we know what life and happiness is. Liberty, it's kind of this complicated definition. For our purposes, the closest thing I can explain liberty is, to make it simple for you guys, is it's somewhat like freedom. They're not exactly the same thing, but let's just go with freedom on that. So here is a perhaps clearer translation. In more simple language, I wrote, we think that these thoughts are clear, that all men are created the same, and God gives us certain rights that cannot be taken away. Some of these rights are life, freedom, and the ability to chase or pursue happiness. There's our painting again. A couple quotes as they're signing, and I'll explain these. One guy from Virginia was said to another guy, he said, I shall have great advantage over you, Mr. Gary, when we are all hung for what we are doing. From the size and the weight of my body, I shall die in a few minutes, but for the lightness of your body, you will dance in the air an hour or two before you are dead. Ben Franklin said, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately. And he uses the word hang twice. The first hang is he's talking about sticking together as a group. The second one, he's talking about a literal hanging. That's how people were executed or killed back then. John Hancock said, let them double their reward. He said this because the British already were after him and there was a reward out. So my question is, why do we have these grim and scary quotes when these delegates or representatives were signing it? And I put in here, the British already had rewards out for the capture of some of the signers. Additionally, if the colonists lost the war, the signers would be labeled as traitors and would be executed. What they were doing when they signed this is they were committing treason. Treason is betrayal of country, and that's a crime. So they all knew this was a brave act by them. They all knew when they signed this, if the Americans lost the war,